Harry, I've gotten the question so many times is that this $454 million judgment, which keeps going up every day by $112,000 per day, and you got to put out, if you did bond, if you had to use a bond company, about $19 to $20 million, that's just something you never get back. That could you invoke the Eighth Amendment that this has gone too far? Because usually people think of cruel and unusual punishment as like violent punishment or long-term prison sentences, in solitary confinement, but there are provisions with the Eighth Amendment about financial penalties.
Absolutely. So in politics, we should never assume that because something is insane, it will not be done. Equally plain in our highly politicized judicial system, we should never presume that because something is idiotic, it will not be done. And so if you look at Judge Ingoran's ruling on February the 16th in a New York civil fraud case, a case without any victims and without any fraud, you could argue that the ruling was at a minimum insane. However, it's important to keep in mind that there is something called the Eighth Amendment, which constitutes a limitation on the power of the state to impose penalties which are ungrounded in rational analysis. And so let's look, for instance, at the Thames versus Indiana case, which was decided in 2019. In that particular case, the police in Indiana seized Tyson Thames' Land Rover, then worth around $42,000, and he purchased that from life insurance money that he received when his dad passed away. The state sought a civil forfeiture of the vehicle. Why? Because Thames had pled guilty to a drug dealing and conspiracy charge in the amount of $10,000. The state of Indiana claimed that the Eighth Amendment is inapplicable to the state of Indiana judgment. It only applies to federal cases, but the United States Supreme Court, in a unanimous opinion, held that it does apply, and it limits the ability of the state to impose crazy penalties. Equally clear here, you could make the same argument with the state of New York. And now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's going to be an easy road. It will require appeals. It will require making sure that either the federal courts or the Supreme Court, for instance, takes jurisdiction. But there clearly is a basis within the Eighth Amendment. You could argue that the penalties imposed by New York are excessive.
Yeah, well, you want to go to the phones, 1-800-688-431, Tim, because, again, people are asking over and over, but you see how this could take another side angle in the legal system, and now you've got a constitutional law question, which is in the state court. A question that probably
a lot of us should answer, just so you know. Let's go to Joe, who's calling in Maryland on line one. Joe, you're on the air.
Yes, sir. This is Joe from Maryland. Thanks for taking my call. If somebody else could pay this bill for former President Trump if they wanted to, I mean, is that legal for somebody to do that, to raise funds for it, or Mr. Trump himself to raise funds for it, or some other wealthy billionaire pay that fund?
So, let me just jump in. Just so, of course, this is a New York State case. I know in federal cases, and we can check a dive on the New York State law real quick, guys. Will you do that? Just take a quick dive to see. But I know in the federal courts, Harry, that's not unusual. In fact, the most recent main example of that was that Hunter Biden, a friend of his, put up the money for his bond. It was it wasn't this big, but it was in the millions.
Absolutely.
And so in the federal system, you absolutely can have someone else put up the bond, because ultimately what they're saying is, I'll lose this money if my friend, or like in this case, it would be President Trump, doesn't comply.
Like co-signing on an apartment, it's very similar.
With even more responsibility to the one who's giving the money, because if President Trump or the organization didn't comply, you would lose it all.
Right.
Absolutely. So you could argue that there's no reason in the world why, unless there's some specific New York law to the contrary, why citizens of the United States could not gift money to Donald Trump and enable him to pay the fine out of those particular funds. Also, Donald Trump is seeking a delay in the enforcement of this ruling. Whether that will be granted by the New York courts or not, we don't know at this particular point. but I don't see any reason in principle why people can't send gifts to Donald Trump.
And technically, his appeal of this fine, though they filed a notice of appeal, you can't actually appeal in New York officially until you've hit the bond has been posted. Though you could certainly then go to a separate court and say, this is, we believe, unconstitutional, which brings up, again, a whole different line of argument because you're talking about constitutional issues now. I think, ultimately, end of the day here, President Trump's going to figure this out. He's the leading Republican candidate. It's a lot of money. I know he would rather not have to put that kind of money up. But if you notice on the campaign trail, Logan, he's not like saying, I can't do it.
No. Well, I mean, I don't feel like he would.
Brand-wise, he can't not do it. You know what I'm saying?
I don't know. What do you mean?
If you're Donald Trump's brand and you can't make
you can't afford it. Yeah, exactly. No, that's not going to be. Even if he couldn't afford it, that wouldn't be the way he'd go from a marketing point of view.
That's not the issue. The issue is we need time to put the right assets together. You gave us 30 days. Now they're
still a lot lot for anyone.
I think they're at 24 days now. I think it was 27 days on Friday.
Most businesses don't have that ready to go liquid. Just all of a sudden to just
no. I mean that's what she said. I'm looking at that
over.
building, but well, you said Mar-a-Lago's really worth $18 million. So what's the building in New York going to be worth? Are you going to lowball that? I mean, it's just we know it's not $18 million based on our own experience with New York real estate. There's not you don't buy a tower in New York for $18 million.
No, I don't think you can barely get a condo in
But they're going to try to, I think, lowball on all those issues. But Harry, ultimately, I think what people want to know is does he have a serious claim on the Eighth Amendment when you get this size fine? And it seems like you believe he does.
I believe he does. And you can recharacterize the so-called civil fraud penalty as a judgment that is in actual criminal law as opposed to civil fraud. And clearly, this would constitute an excessive fine within the meaning of the Eighth Amendment. And I think he has a absolute case. And I think as a former law professor, this would be a dream issue to research and write about.
Let's take one more call before the break at 1-800-684-3110. Let's
go, Michael. I think Michael in Arizona. You're on the air, Michael.
Hello, gentlemen. The question is there any recourse of Trump to sue for his legal expenses provided he is successful in his litigation so he can replenish without continually going broke like Flynn and Giuliani have? And lastly, how could the public participate without it being illegal campaign contributions if we create a grassroots movement to really collect money for the defense?
I think a legal fund would be set up separately. They have their own set of rules aside from a campaign fund. So that'd be separate. And I know there's some people that have thrown those out there. Be very careful right now in donating to those. If it's not been endorsed by President Trump clearly, like on his own social media with his links, be careful about what's out there because bad actors try to use this as a time to say, hey, you're helping President Trump. We're putting together a legal defense fund for him. And then you read the small print. It's some organization you never heard of.
Be careful where you're donating.
Be careful where that money's going. But here, overall, the idea is that you can get these resources together. That there's a way to pool together. They're just having to do it in a way that's very, very quick while he's on the campaign trail.
I think that is true. And with respect to whether or not Trump can get reimbursement from the state, I think that would be highly doubtful. I think the state would be able to claim immunity from being required to reimburse him with respect to the legal fees he's incurred. And so that if I'm sued by the state of New York, I can't then go back to this state of New York unless there's a statutory provision and then ask for legal fees. I'm not sure there's going to be a strong legal basis for that.
The best thing you happen is you're going to get back what you posted bond if you would.
Correct.
You get back your $450 million. You're probably not going to get legal fees. You probably have to show something plus just that the fact that you didn't like the charges they brought and you beat them ultimately, but that there was like some kind of wrongdoing or corruption, kind of like what's going on in Georgia. They'd have to find was going on in New York. There was some of that with Letitia James because she ran on defeating Trump, but that's again why she's not presenting so far this case. We're following it all very closely for you.